Another round completed of Total War Remastered. And this time, I do have Carthage. Now, to sort of like give like a heads up and like, credit where it's basically due, these pictures are basically based off, and the list is basically based off of the one that was basically done by QualityOldGames. And, for most part, the only reason I basically like, make a new tier list here is because I like to have the generals differentiated from like, the Long Shield Cavalry and the Sticker Band. So we can actually tell what generals are versus what they aren't. Because I have a big impact on like, the ratings here. So yeah. Alright, well, I've broken it down into infantry, ranged, and like, cavalry. Elephants and generals basically separating the, horsemen basically from all that stuff over there. So first things first. I will note that I actually have, of course, playlists already for Numidia, the Roman rosters, and stuff like that. So I'll note that as a result of that, you'll probably actually notice that some of like these values I obviously have here from like the other list are a little bit different from like what's basically like been presented thus far. Not for the peasants though. So Carthaginian peasants. These guys are still, of course, just a B overall. So they're laudable. They do a good job. Their basic goal basically in this game is just to sort of like hold towns and be like, your garrison troop. And they're very good at it because they're basically very cheap. And, they don't have very much of an upgrade cost. And they also have a big unit size, so that basically helps with like, keeping law and order in your settlements. So, they do their job fairly well. Not a whole lot more to say about that. Their combat abilities are basically trash. You really don't want to be defending with peasants because they're just going to break just easily. They're basically using pitchforks as opposed to like, the Romans who basically use daggers, so they're like swordsmen. But, there's no real change between these guys and the Romans really in regards to like the combat abilities. They still suck. So, laudable. Not much more to say about that. That's where to go. Now, I'll note that for town militia here. Note that these guys, I basically have like a 2 for usage. It doesn't actually make them like, more an F tier because, these guys of course are still F tier, like the town watch the Romans, but I did actually have to use town watch basically to, defend myself with the Carthaginians. The thing about the Carthaginian territories, like, down in Africa, is that when they're basically spreading out to like conquer Numidia or, basically go after like these very like, low tier settlements that basically are just out in the field, you're probably going to have to basically build some town militia perhaps from time to time because you don't really have like any good structures basically to build in those settlements. And town militia is basically all you've got, unfortunately. You also start with a ton of town like militia basically with Carthage's like starting position. They basically have like a little bit in Spain, I think, some in like Palma and stuff like that. And you're not really going to be able to sort of like get away from like not using them like early on at least, or like in an emergency. So you do use these guys a little bit, but they're still trash units. They're bursting like peasants for like garrisoning a town. They're basically like about as effective as like peasants basically combat wise, and no morale, no like ability to sort of like fight combat troops. They're basically there to sort of like defend towns to be like a step above peasants, but they're not really. So yeah, they're still like the worst unit in the game. They're tied with like the worst unit in the game. Town watch, whatever. Alright, now, a little bit better than town militia is the Iberian infantry, but not by much. Not by much at all. These guys are basically a very cheap and expendable unit that, like, Carthage can basically like train from like their tier 2 barracks. And they're basically the equivalent of the Hastati, but they aren't Hastati. If you built like 2 like, Iberian infantry, I'm not sure they'd be able to like be able to fight off like a Hastati because they're just so weak. They don't have any morale. Their combat abilities are basically worse, and they don't like throw pillar or anything like that, so they're really just like bad. The only like bright side they basically have is that you can basically like train them anywhere. So if you basically like lose these guys, you can easily like replenish them easily enough. But they're like a horrible unit to say the least. I will say that I had to use these guys like of course because they're still your standard like bog standard infantry, so you do have to like use them, but they're really not like, a great unit. And, that's all I can really say about them. Libyan Spearmen. Now, these guys I used a little bit more than like, the Iberian Infantry. And, they're basically just like, just a shy, a little bit like worse than like, peasants, I guess, how I basically regard them. These guys basically are like your tier 3, like, barracks like infantry. And they're basically like, town walks improved. And what I mean by say like town walks improved is that these guys basically don't really have like, an awesome attack or anything like that. They're basically spearmen. But they do have like some decent armor and staying power, so they can at least like sort of like hold the line a little bit compared to like the Iberians. And it basically tries like say like cavalry. They'll be able to like withstand the cavalry like charge like a little bit better than like the Iberians too. Um, they're still really bad like to sort of like hold the line, but I mean they're a little bit more mobile at least, and like they won't immediately fall, so they at least have some laudable qualities basically to them. I'll note that basically like in my campaign, these guys are probably my most used infantry because pony infantry like you require tier 4 barracks. That's gonna take a while to basically get to, and if you're basically going to like barbarian territories, they don't actually have any like tier 4 barracks because they can't build that high. And even like you go into like the Roman areas or the Greek areas, you go like early on like as the Carthage you're probably going to, they may not even have like the tier 4 barracks basically up yet. So you're gonna use these guys probably like as your mainstay like force perhaps when you basically get them. So they are what they are. They're not the greatest, but they have some lovable qualities at least. Um, Pawnee Infantry and Sacred Band. I'm going to talk about these guys basically like collectively here. So note that both these guys basically like they're basically around like Libyan like spearman territory. I'll throw basically you here, I guess. No, that's the wrong spot. Go right there, and these guys can just go here. Alright, so these are basically like, both units that are phalanx units. And you basically get like the pony infantry from like, tier 4 barracks, and you get the sacred band from like, a tier 4 temple. Now these like two units, they're like, okay, I guess. But to take like, of course, a tier 4 barracks or like a temple, like tier 4 temple, sort of like, get to. And they're very, very hard to sort of like, replenish when you basically get that high, like, tier 4 stuff. I'll note that the pony infantry, they're kind of like armor hoplites in a way. They basically have like a little bit less armor than like armor hoplites, but they basically have like all the same like defense skills and like attack skills and like all that stuff. So they're not like terrible. And then there's like Sacred Band, which is basically just awesome, but they take like 2 turns to train, and like you have to build that tier 4 temple, which may not be the easiest thing to sort of like get access to always. So, they're not terrible. Now these like units, like when you basically get to like the late game, they are pretty useful. I like to basically use these guys to sort of like poke at say like the Britons when I basically get around to like hitting their chariots, or against like Gaul they're okay as well because you can basically use it against their like their generals or their noble cavalry and stuff like that. German too. They're not too great against the Greeks though when you basically get around to them. Like by the time I was basically building like pony infantry and like sacred band, the Romans were basically dead. Like the Brudi obviously have like Apollonia, Salona, and Segestica over there on like the Balkan coast. But when I basically like got up to like say the Greeks with their like armored high plates, they basically send like droves of like armored hoplites at you, and like these guys like they don't like stand a chance basically against like that. You can't build enough sacred band to sort of compete with them. You can't build like well, you can't build these guys basically massive like you have the tier 4 barracks, but they're gonna get torn to shreds basically from the armored hoplites because they have like higher armor. So they're laudable units. I mean, they're still useful in like some situations, but they're not the best at what they do. So that's basically where I can put them like laudable. That's about it, as high as it go. And you're gonna basically notice a big trend here, by the way. The best units that like Carthage basically has are mostly just in here, like the B tier. There's basically like one unit I basically have an excellent, I think, and one for like fantastic, but a lot of these units are just not that great. Anyhow, that's basically their like lead roster, and as you can see, it's like a lot of like very like mediocre units. They're not by like any means like terrible. It's just that they aren't that great. So infantry is definitely not the strength for like Carthage. And let's move on to like the skirmishers here. So now I'll note that with like the skirmishers here. Note that these guys, I basically have like values very similar to like Numidia, so they aren't like as like very low as like Veltays basically in like, the Roman roster. But I still basically consider these guys to be like pretty terrible. Not as terrible as say like the Iberian infantry here, but they're pretty terrible. Now, why you may actually want to use skirmishers, by the way, as opposed to say like slingers down here. The thing about like the Carthaginian like roster is that they don't really have any sort of like archers besides their elephants. Like these guys, the war elephants and like the armor elephants, they can provide like withering fire stuff, but you don't really have like a dedicated like archery type unit. And as a result of that, like the skirmishers are going to be like sort of like useful to like throw their like they're like little pelts or like they're like javelins basically over the line. And that's something you really can't really do with like the javelins. And you're not really going to use it like archers for that purpose because there's crap. But I found I was actually like using these guys like a little bit more as a result of that, because even though I could get like say Balearic slingers or like mercenary like peltists, I was also able to get like the Cretan archers at least once or twice because I was down like near Apollyon eventually. But the thing is like you need to have like something to sort of like throw over your lines and sort of like contribute a little bit of like damage. And you have like a little purpose to actually use them in Carthage, so they're deficient, but they're not like overly terrible. And I consider like slingers, archers, and heavy archers, those are very terrible. I mean, 12, 11, 9, they're literally going to be like like that down here. Slingers basically they have like the base like box standard slinger, they don't have any range basically to them, so you can't really use them to sort of like pelt enemies basically with them very well. You can like use it to sort of like defend like your like city walls, but do you really want to be like spending like your like money basically like using these guys to sort of defend? Probably not. They're not like the best at it, so it's almost like to the point where it's actually better to sort of like let your walls be taken with like Carthage, for example, sometimes, and it's like sort of like fight it off in the street with like your pony infantry or even your Libyan spearmen, because it might send the cavalry and it can just like mop them up with your Libyan spearmen usually enough, but whatever. All right, so that's basically the like archery like guys down here. I'll note with like archers, by the way, they're still basically like kind of worthless for like Carthage basically to use. They will say they actually have like a purpose, by the way. So while like I don't really think much like siege weaponry in this game, one like useful for like the Carthaginian like archer and like heavy archer is that you can basically knock down walls, which is like possibly a good thing for you to basically do. The thing about like Carthage here is that they don't really have very good like wall taking infantry. Like none of these guys basically like really well suited to like fighting on like on a wall. So you may want to basically have it so like you send like an archer basically with your army, so they're not knocked down the wall, make like a little like hole so they're gonna basically walk in your guys. I'll note that they're a little bit though like at the same time reduced in their effectiveness because of elephants. And for those who basically don't know, elephants can be used to knock down palisades or like wooden barricades very easily. And like as a result of that, you can basically just like use the elephants to sort of like knock down early sense if you want. And you don't basically slow down your army either, so this is another like instance where these guys just sort of suck. All right, now that's basically it for like these like units here. These units down here are a little bit better because they're all cavalry based, and if there's one thing that like Carthage has going for it, it's just cavalry. All right, so first things first, Long Shield Cavalry. These guys are mediocre. They aren't like terrible. They're still like a light skirmisher cavalry that like you can use to like knock down skirmishers early on and like do hammer and anvil tactics with. They aren't the best ones, but I mean, basically all cavalry in this game is basically overpowered. So even like the worst like of the worst, and this isn't the worst I don't think, but basically mediocre. That's a fairly like standard like thing for like a very like box standard like cavalry like this. Another one thing about this cavalry, by the way, is that like it is like very easy to replace, by the way, and it's very cheap. So that's basically a couple of good points basically for the Long Shield Cavalry that like basically makes me more inclined to sort of use them as opposed to say like Greek cavalry or like equites. So I did actually like use these guys quite a bit. So they're mediocre, They're not the best, but they're good, not like, horrible, so they're fine. Alright, now, Long Shield Cavalry, and this is the first one and only one that gets the S tier. I mean, you saw in the media roster basically did, if you basically saw that one, that these guys basically ranked all the way up there because they're just the best light infantry, or light cavalry basically sort of get with the other factions. I'll note that someone's probably gonna note say the Roman cavalry, but I mean you need to get Marian reforms in order to get Roman cavalry. So these guys basically have all the time, and they're just awesome. You can basically just run roughshod over the map with them. There is one downside to these guys, by the way, because I was able to sort of wipe out the media with these guys. I was able to wipe out Spain with these guys. Did a lot of damage to Rome. But when I basically got up to Gaul and Britain, where well, Gaul was basically fine. These guys did okay with Gaul, but when we basically got to Britain, they got those chariots, and they don't do so well against chariots. And of course, the Greeks and Macedonians are also there as well. They have pikes, and they don't really do good against pikes. Same with Germania, they have their spear war end. They're not terrible. So they have issues, these guys, but I mean, they're little cons are not going to be outweighed by the pros. So a fantastic unit to use. Definitely the best one in the Carthaginian roster for sure. So they're up there. Now this might come off as a little bit we'll say opinionated, I guess we'll say, but I don't think much of Sigurd Band Cavalry. These guys, of course, are the best heavy cavalry that cavalry is basically able to get, and they're only heavy cavalry basically able to get. But you basically need to get these guys at the best cavalry type of stables you can basically build, which basically sort of hurts their ability to sort of be picked up. And on top of that, basically, when you basically get these guys and want to replace them, you'll basically have to find again a tier for cavalry stable in order to replenish them. Compared to say Long Shield Cavalry, I think these guys are just they take 2 turns to train. They have a hard time to sort of be replenished. I'd rather just basically send a horde of Long Shield Cavalry out to do my business rather than build these guys. So I just don't really think much of them. They're just a crappy unit for the most part for me. So this might be very controversial, but right down here indeed efficient, because that's where they think they belong. And that's basically it for the cavalry. So you have a couple mediocre and why is it so bad? I have no idea. It's just down there. And you have the Long Shield Cavalry basically all the way up here. But all right, well, it's time to move on to the elephants. And this is basically what Carthage is basically known for. It's elephants, right? So we have our standard elephant, we have our war elephant, we have our armor elephant. Starting with the elephant, by the way, these guys are kind of similar to the round shield cavalry. Now, I'll note that I basically rank the round shield cavalry basically a little bit higher. These guys are 17, these guys are 16. And I think that's for a really good reason. I think that these basic elephants you basically have, they don't have any archers on their backs. And they're basically useful for knocking down a gate or a wooden wall, but I wouldn't really want to send them basically into a horde of infantry because they're not exactly that effective and sort of breaking them up very easily. You can use them flying against the Romans, you can bash against Astati, for example, or you can use them against Spain, but they're very prone to being driven berserk from fire arrows or skirmishers or whatever. And that's basically a big issue with all elephants, by the way. They can all be driven berserk from too many things, I find. So that's basically a major con basically for him, and basically why I'm ranking him that mediocre, this guy. And then you have the war elephant and the armored elephant. The war elephant, that's definitely better than the round shield cavalry. Armored elephant basically it's basically over here. Yeah, that's basically where I throw it. And my head's on off there for a little bit, but basically the thing about the war elephant and the armor elephant, these guys have very similar stats except for the armor elephant have more armor basically on it, and this guy of course being available at the tier 3 stable as opposed to tier 4. Now, I do actually really like the the war elephant, I guess we'll say, but I basically just using the armor elephant for the most part. The thing about Carthage is that they don't really need to use their elephants really against any real enemy for the most part. You have like your Long Shield Cavalry, which was like, just awesome, and you really just use these guys as like hammer and anvil rather than like, have these guys sort of mock for like the enemy lines. And I did actually use these guys like a little bit against, say, like Egypt or like, against the Greeks. But the armor elephants basically they take too long in order to like, get these guys, and you have to like, build like, say, like Carthage or like, Phaxus or Cirta down like, near like the Carthage like homelands. And same like with the war elephant, and like the elephant by the way over here as well, by the way. But the thing about like these elephants here is that like they are very like effective at sort of like breaking down like enemy cavalry or getting basically into like some like quickly and stuff like that. But they're like horribly expensive or like take these guys around. Like something that people basically like tend to like overlook on like, these elephants that they have a very like high upkeep, and doesn't like blow against like the sacred like band cavalry. However, by the way, these guys have like a horrible upkeep as well. But elephants are basically like very very expensive beasts to like maintain on the field, and you may want to have like one or two of them, but they're just one of these units that like if you build like a whole lot of them, then yeah, you might be able to like overrun like a lot of enemies, but it's gonna like cost you a lot of money basically like losing the elephants. So I mean they're okay, but they're not my favorite unit to say the least. And then we have the generals. Now, note that these generals basically are ranked higher than like the generals for like the Romans, I think, and as well as Nvidia. And it's because like they don't really have like a dedicated heavy cavalry like the Romans do eventually. Like they have a secret band, but I mean you have to take like so long to get those that like it's like not worth it. So let's just see here. So this is I believe the regular bodyguard, and then we have like our like advanced bodyguard here. So I rank basically like the early bodyguard as being like an excellent unit. And early on, basically, when you don't have like a whole lot of like heavy cavalry, these guys can sort of help you out with like hammer and elbowing things, like breaking down people. Like the Carthaginian like generals are actually like pretty decent for like what they basically do, and I guess that basically goes to show because they're basically what like Carthage alive basically all those years, but whatever. And I'll just throw it out here by as well. I never actually got to use like the late general because the thing about him is that you require like the American forms to kick off, so I didn't let the Romans do that, so I didn't really get to use them. But again, once you basically get into like the later parts of like the game, when you basically have access to like a sacred band cavalry or like armored elephants, these guys are like less useful. So you can probably like hold back and not have to like send basically into fray to do as much. And you probably don't want to get them killed anyway, so. Like these guys, you might get them killed, but you'll probably be able to keep them alive if you're lucky. So, yeah. All right. Well, that's basically my like look at basically the Carthage like unit roster. For the most part, like compared to say like the other ones that basically like done, and we'll just basically go through that in a moment. But I'll just pause it. We'll just bring them up one moment. All right. I basically saved the list and like brought up the other ones here. So. I just want to sort of like throw this out here, but this is actually something that's very like noticeable about the Carthaginian like unit roster versus like the other ones. Like I'm not basically look at say Nvidia one I basically recently did. They have a sort of like balanced like unit roster where they have like some duds basically here, but they also have some like very like decent like units basically up here as well. So they overall basically have like a very like strong cavalry roster, like Numidians, and the infantry and like archers and stuff like that. They're okay. This stuff down here is not that great. You look at say Romans here as well. They have like they have like some like very lobby units as well, and there's some terrible units basically in there because they have like so many of them. But laudable, mediocre. They're not like terrible like overall their units. But Carthage here, they have like some lobby units, but a lot of their units basically are like just not that great for the most part. I don't think. They don't really have like any real stance to sort of like speak of like the Romans at least have like their stati. They have like their like their general. They have principes. They have like early legionaries and like legionaries and stuff like that, and like Roman auxiliary. They have like some decent infantry, but Carthage they just have like their like Long Shield Cavalry I think for the most part, and like everything else basically is like very bland and like very ineffective. And it's actually something to note about like Carthage by the way. This is actually like a very well designed faction because it doesn't feel like they have like any real strength, but when you basically throw all these units together, they actually are very like decent like faction to basically play. Like I'll note that like even though like it looks like I'm bashing Carthage here quite a bit for like their unit like rankings, I actually like consider this to be like one of the best factions we see in the game to sort of play. So basically everything is like kind of shitty in a way, but it's balanced shitty. Like there is a purpose to like everything you basically see here, even though I've ranked it say kind of low in some of these places. But overall, this is actually a fairly like decent faction to basically play. And let's see, units are like very much like not really basically like standing out and be like overly excellent stuff for like the Long Shield Cavalry, but um, at the same time, everything basically plays a purpose here. Like there's no real standouts because you don't need to have like any real standout basically really so to speak of. All right, well that's basically it for like Carthage. This is very like short list I guess to say the least for this one because they have like some units, but for the most part their units basically are very easy sort of to explain and like to just get on with it so to speak. Perhaps if the next one we'll see if that's a little bit more like challenging to sort of explain. We'll see about that. Okay, so take care all.